Morning, everyone. I am Ria Valerie Cabanes, the chair of the UPOU IREC and program chair of Master of Arts in Nursing at UPOU. I will be your moderator or host for today's research conversation. The Research Conversations Ethics Series 2021 is a joint collaboration between UPOU Research and Publication of OVCAA and UPOU Institutional Research Ethics Committee. Primarily, it aims to disseminate and increase the awareness of UPOU stakeholders as well as the public on the importance of ethics in research. And today's topic is ethics and privacy in research. And we are very privileged and honored to have our speaker from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, who will talk about a very relevant and crucial topic in the world of research. To formally start our webinar, may I call on Dr. Primo Garcia, the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs of the University of the Philippines Open University, for his welcome remarks.
Dr. Myra Oruga, IREC Chair Professor Ria Cabanes, students, faculty members, colleagues, viewers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The world we live in right now is facing a host of challenges. The world needs solutions to complex problems arising from the lingering effects of the pandemic, the worsening degradation of the environment, increasing socioeconomic inequality, and marginalization caused by social exclusion. As students and academics, we can contribute to addressing these challenges by systematically examining these problems and recommending innovative solutions. These can be done through research, and not just ordinary research, but ethical research. For our studies to be impactful, they do not only need to be relevant and rigorous, they have to be ethical. Gone are the days when we can do research with our blinders on, oblivious to the potential negative impacts of our work on the people we intend to serve through our research. When done ethically, research can help protect the dignity, rights, and privacy of our research participants, as well as increase the legitimacy of our work. If we are really serious about our claims to sustainability, then we need to consider our research participants as co-creators of knowledge and not just mere sources of data. And so we need to ensure that their interests and rights are also protected in the process. We are glad that UPOU has recently worked towards institutionalizing the research ethics review process in the university. We are pleased to note that UPOU has been granted Level 1 accreditation in 2021. Today's webinar is part of UPOU's thrust to further promote values and principles of research ethics in the university and beyond. Once again, I would like to thank everyone for tuning into today's research conversation. Our thanks go to the UPOU Research and Publications Committee and the UP Open University Institutional Research Ethics Committee for organizing this event. May this webinar provide a space for us to learn and appreciate more the values of ethics in research. Maraming pong salamat sa inyong lahat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garcia. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all our audience to post your questions in the chat room. All questions will be addressed later during the Q&A portion with our guest speaker. In case we cannot accommodate your questions, you may leave your email address so we can send you the answers there. Please be reminded that e-certificates will be issued after answering the evaluation form that will be available after this webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Research Conversations, Ethics Series 2021, Ethics and Privacy in Research. Our speaker today is a chairman of Privacy Experts Group, eHealth, Department of Health, and Department of Science and Technology. He is a member and lecturer of the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, Subcommittee on Information Dissemination, Training, and Advocacy. Our speaker is also the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Open Data, University of the Philippines, Diliman. He has been a research consultant, a recipient of several international publications award from the University of the Philippines, a referee of various journals, and a research fellow on ethical issues in international research at the School of Public Health, Harvard University. Currently, he is working on data privacy, open data, research ethics, digital humanities, ethical issues in medical migration, epistemology of social media, ethical issues on genomics, ethical issues in medical tourism, culture of compliance in healthcare, forensic ethics, and social stratification in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Dr. Peter C.
Maraming salamat, Ma'am Ria. Magandang umaga sa lahat. So we have quite a ground to cover today. This topic takes longer than what we have allotted for this session. But I want this to be an interactive activity, hopefully, so far as the platform allows us. I said it's quite a ground to cover. Sometimes it takes 2 days, but obviously we didn't have 2 days. So what I'm going to do is to direct you to some resources that you can use to follow through on the topics included in this discussion. So we're going to talk about ethics and privacy in research. I understand we have an audience of aspiring researchers. So while we while I go through my slides, I urge you to visit these websites for the materials I have compiled for you. Notes.ethicist.org and privacyph.org. So you have quite a handful already multitasking while multitasking in this work. In this session. First, let's take up what we mean by research. This is a definition accepted by the UST and the international community, referring to activities that develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge, including theories, principles, or relationships, or any accumulation of information using scientific method, observations, inferences, and analysis. So if your activity is not covered by this or does not include these aspects, it may not be research by definition. Another important concept that we have to account is the so-called human subjects. So who are human subjects? So human subjects research rather, this is referring to activities involving systematic collection and analysis of data with the intent to generate new knowledge, exposing human beings to manipulation, intervention, observation, or other interactions with investigators. Specifically, we are interested in individuals becoming identifiable for their records, biological materials. So these are human subjects. Now, there is an exercise normally when I conduct workshop. I allow our participants to be exposed to some activities that will enable them to have a nuanced understanding of the subject. So in this case, I urge you to visit privacyph.org/human research for certain use cases of what we consider as human subjects research. Now, research ethics is simply the study of these activities of research in an ethical way. And so you're looking at the conduct of research, and including the outcomes of such research. So we have a framework to evaluate the value or the ethics of research. So in this particular session, we may ask ourselves the question: are the ethical issues in online research methods distinct and unique compared to those associated with offline methods? Because I understand most of our researchers on this call are doing online research. Most, at least some rather, are doing online research. So you can go either for the separation of the two, the online and the offline, or you have a more integrated view of the two. So these are at least two quick quick takes, no, on the schools of thought on what counts as online research as being unique or in the same basically as with offline or analog research. We'll make the answer clearer later on. No? But first, we'll have a quick review of the principles of research, especially for our students who may not be familiar with the discipline, with the field. So you might have heard of principles of beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. These are the guiding principles in research. So when we speak of beneficence, bene means good, mal means bad. So what's going to be beneficial to subjects and stakeholders, that's the principle of beneficence. You maintain a favorable risk benefit ratio. It's least, you're using the least risky alternative to achieve results, and you're considering proportionate or reasonableness of the approach in relation to anticipated benefits to subjects. No, that's the concept of beneficence. You may also have to contend with the types of risk and benefits involved in research. There's physical, there's economic, social, and psychological. Physical, you might get harmed, as in injured. Economic, you might lose some income. Social, you might experience some stigma, psychological trauma. So these are the risk involved. It's a straightforward calculation involving probability and harm. So when we speak of risk, it's always made up of two aspects. There's the probability aspect and there's this harm aspect. There are two standards when we speak of risk because the threshold is the so-called minimal risk. So once you get to that level, you ask the question, what is the bar? No? And the bar is measured in two things. The daily life standard, meaning the risk that the ordinary people encounters in their daily life, or the routine physical or psychological educational exam standards. So if you expose your subjects to certain risk, the question is the risk they're exposed now higher than what you routinely do with these exams? And if the answer is yes, then it's gonna call upon greater safety measures, or it's going to require greater safety measures. So there's our two scenarios that are typical in the assessment of research. When there's benefit to society only, you normally would allow minimal risk to participants. You don't allow greater than minimal risk if the benefits are not accrued directly to participants. The other scenario, that the research may directly benefit participants, so that you may allow, in that scenario, you may allow more than minimal risk. You may at least, the scenario has to do with at least as favorable as available alternative approaches. And your children may be allowed to participate. So these considerations would distinguish sharply the importance of minimal risk from the other types of risk. So in consideration of respect for persons, the other principle, the regard for the individual as a sovereign entity is central to the exercise of ethics review. So when we look at respect for persons, we look at the individual as sovereign. And this is operationalized in terms of informed consent, which functions as follows. Informed consent promotes individual autonomy and respect for persons. It encourages rational decision making and public involvement. It avoids fraud and duress. It encourages self-scrutiny by researchers, because you will have to write your rationale, your purpose, the method, articulate it in the informed consent form, and hopefully reduce civil or criminal liability of researchers and their institutions. You may also have to examine the elements of informed consent when you are asked to give informed consent, or when you solicit informed consent. And one of those elements is voluntariness, whether the consent is freely given versus one involving fraud, deception, coercion. The other element has to do with the capacity to understand, so that you cannot just ask for informed consent from people who may not have the capacity to give consent to begin with. So these are important considerations. No? And the last but not the least is information disclosure. The question whether the information you are communicating with, or trying to communicate with the participants, is sufficient is an important consideration. And then you have, last but not least, the justice or fairness principle. You have to take into account fair selection of subjects. So in your study, the principle of justice and fairness is operationalized this way. You will have to ask the question whether your study is really scientifically valid, whether sampling is representative for those studies that are quantitative, whether eligibility criteria based on scientific importance is put in place, because some other arbitrary criteria might be used instead. There's number that reflects the characteristics and manner of selection. So overall, this criteria would have to answer to the question of scientific validity. The other set of criteria has to do with ethical soundness. You ask the question whether there is fairness in choosing participants. You ask the question whether there's equity in terms of recruitment, in terms of the benefits of research. You ask the question whether there's equal opportunity to participate and benefit given the target population of the study. You will also have to look at the levels of participation, participant selection. On the sampling level, you ask the question whether you are able to determine the eligibility of individuals or groups in the basis of inclusion and exclusion criteria. You make sure that there is minimal to no bias at all, whether there is transparency in the sampling. You also have to look at the actual recruitment. So sampling is one thing, recruitment is another. This is an event now that involves actual recruitment of people or research subjects, inviting individuals to participate. And so you ask the question whether that process involves any deception, therapeutic misconception, undue inducement, or coercion. And then finally, you ask the question whether you retaining research subjects or research participants fairly. You keep them enrolled for certain measures, including management of withdrawals, because especially for panel data, for studies that involve multiple visits, some of your participants may no longer be interested in seeing you the second or third time. You ask the question whether compensation is fair, or is being done at all. Now, there is greater attention, greater focus now being paid uh, to the vulnerable subjects. I'm not able to discuss all aspects of this, but I direct you to some materials that you can use to follow through on the question, no? And that is notesethics.org/vulnerability. So there are important considerations when we deal with the vulnerable, no? Whether online or offline. How were participants chosen? Is there fair inclusion exclusion criteria? So the same criteria that you use with non-vulnerable should be equally applied to the vulnerable. How are they related to the research? Is there power differential? Are you researching on your students who may not have um, the capacity to say no to you because they're under your influence? Could they have said no? Are they fairly compensated? That's another question. The Helsinki Declaration, Article 19, defines the vulnerable as a groups or individuals having increased likelihood of being wronged or incurred harm. So that is a straightforward definition of the vulnerable. So part of that is really taking into account their safety and dignity when they are being included in our study. So there is the organizers of this call wanted me to dwell on ethics of online research. And so the question earlier in the poll, whether the ethics online research is distinct from analog offline research. So here's a thought. Now, one is that there's a convergence actually for online settings of thought that the research ethics for online settings are not special. They are derivable from the ethics of offline settings. So the method may be special. The environment may be a little bit stylized, may be highly digitized, but not necessarily different in important respects. There is interdependence between the two, so that it's not uncommon these days to have offline preparatory work for you to do your interviews online, or vice versa. Both online and offline will have to be concerned about privacy as well. No, what may be special are certain methodologies that you may have hard pressed to find in the analog situation. No? So this is online. Researchers using a dating app called Tinder to be able to navigate otherwise difficult analog situations in the war zone, for instance. No, you cannot be interviewing Israelis and Palestinians and expect to be expect the travel, for instance, no, to be smooth. No, there's going to be so much trouble, navigating through this sensitive area in the Middle East. No, so talking about this particular research, the researcher is able to interview both sides of the camps, primarily because she's a woman, and women have powers to attract men in this regard. No, not being sexist there, but in this particular use case, she was successful in talking to partisans in both sides, no, of the conflict. So privacy is important in research because you see this being emphasized by journals nowadays, no, and you see as concrete implementation of this principle. You see journals retracting papers now because of privacy violations. So what is privacy? There are various definitions of privacy, but the ones that are most relevant to research are these definitions. No? One, something that harks back to the 1890 paper of Warren and Brandeis in the Harvard Law Review, defining privacy as the right to be let alone. And that is the general idea of what counts as privacy. On the other hand, there is a more direct impact on how people conduct themselves in daily life, and that has to do with what we call decisional privacy, meaning persons, families, groups deciding for themselves what to do with their life, how to die, how to reproduce. And basically, that kind of definition is pitted against a more state-driven action. So you would want to protect your citizens from state intrusions. The other definition, and that is for most part what the National Privacy Commission will be using or is using, has to do with what we call informational privacy, meaning the claim of individuals, groups, and institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about themselves is communicated to others. All the way, this harks all the way back to the 1960s, probably the renaissance of privacy research. And so we're faced here with two overlapping concepts now, what we call the human subjects, which the concept we discussed earlier, and data subjects. So that we will have to make a distinction or point out the similarities. So on the one hand, you have human subjects. On the other, you have data subjects. Human subjects are living individuals about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data and identifiable private information. Now, data subjects focus solely on data, but has to do with the processing of data. And let me define quickly what processing means. It's any activity dealing with data would count as processing. There is a major emphasis on consent when with respect to data subjects, as opposed to human subjects where we can have proxy consent. In data subjects, primarily the focus is on direct consent. So in human subjects protection, so we have a distinction: human subjects, data subjects, human subjects protection, data subjects protection. With human subjects protection, the aim is to minimize risk to subjects, bring it to a reasonable level in relation to anticipated benefits. There's also the task to make the selection equitable and making the consent informed, and of course privacy protection. Now, the risk involved with human subjects are physical, economic, social, and possibly also dignitary. And we have discussed this quite very quickly earlier on. These are the same risks attendant to data subjects with an additional highly sensitive dimension, and that is privacy. So in dealing with data subjects, you will have to address the different aspects of risk: physical, economic, social, psychological, dignitary, plus privacy, which in our law is now a criminal matter. So if you violate privacy, for all intents and purposes, you become a criminal. In the human subjects research, the old model, you basically, the most you can get is administrative sanction, civil liability, whereas in dealing with data subjects, there is an added dimension of crime. And that this is where the situation of researchers become more interesting, because there's a possibility that researchers themselves will become criminals if they don't deal with data subjects properly. So data privacy is a bunch of rights actually. No, it's not just a single right. So the right to privacy includes the right to be informed, the right to damages, the right to access your data, the right to file complaint, the right to object to the collection of data, the right to rectify data, the right to erasure or blocking, meaning you don't want your data being held somewhere else anymore, the right to data portability. You can ask for your data, take them with you. So let me just uh, emphasize one of those rights, and that is the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. Researchers, this holds when the researcher doesn't need the data anymore. It can be forgotten when the subject withdraws consent, when the subject objects to the data processing, when the researcher is processing data unlawfully, the data set can be forgotten. The subject was a child at the time of the collection, so that when you are research involving children, it's better for you to quote unquote forget that data once the children reach adulthood. Another important concept in data privacy and research is to do with the concept of personal information. Personal information primarily dealing with identity. You have the ID, you have the iris, some of the biometric measures or identifiers we have. But then increasingly about certain hash, certain facial structures that may be retained even after you take away or you take down your pictures from online from social media, for instance. So it's not uncommon for friends to tag you. What it effectively does is to teach the machine to recognize you, so that even if you're no longer on Facebook, if someone else would upload a picture of you, you're no longer tagged there, the machine is able to recognize you as Juan de la Cruz precisely because of this face print that is characteristic of people's faces. So identity isn't limited to names. As a matter of fact, names are terrible identifiers. Other identifiers are far more effective than just names. Face print is one of those. Now, private information, for specific purposes, individuals are identified, or can reasonably expect not to be made private, not to be made public rather. That is private info, very much interlinked with privacy. Now, the Philippine law distinguishes personal information from sensitive personal information. Now, the connotation of sensitive may not be appropriate here because these types of information are common, and people would not even bat an eyelash when they're asked of, taga saang probinsya ka ba, or whether you're married, how old are you, what is your religion. But the law specifically protects this, provides higher protection to so-called personal information. So this also includes ID and your SALN, or some other information that the Congress may deem sensitive. So in research, there's been a number of leaks, and this is one of the biggest. I'm not sure if anyone is using OkCupid here, but it happened that researchers intentionally leaked the identities or profiles of social media users. You have an exercise that gives you an opportunity to take an inventory of your personal data holdings in your research. And this includes names, TIN, and so on, if your research involves that. So that the person actually controlling the process is what we call the information controller, as opposed to information processor. Now, in research terms, it is important that you see yourself, that you find out whether you are actually the controller, or it's really your research office that's the one controlling the processing of information. No? Because that is an important consideration when liability judgment is meted out. No? So personal information controllers are those natural or juridical persons to whom a personal information controller may outsource the processing of data pertaining to data subjects. Now, this is the processing I was telling you about. Now, anything that you do with data is counted as processing. Now, in dealing with personal data, there are principles also that guide such activities. No, one is transparency, making sure that the policies, purpose, scope, and method processing information is disclosed. No, there is such a thing as data retention limit. It used to be that researchers keep data forever. Nowadays, it's a common practice to sunset data collection. So that transparency, the best way to do that is probably declare this via a website, how you conduct research, Open University, for instance. And part of the reason is that increasingly the world is about data. There is oil crisis. There is scarcity of resources these days with oil, but data presumably or increasingly is becoming more valuable than oil. Hence, the need for transparency. Governance is also about transparency. This election, the coming election, is going to be fought on the basis of information. You can make an argument that the reason, number one, certain candidates are ahead of the others, that they are better at handling data, or if not manipulation of data, what's available information out there. In research terms, you will have to look at transparency even before doing research. You may have to declare how long you're going to keep data, who may have access to data or records. You will have to include policies on processing to opt out, inspect, withdraw, or correct data. Remember the data privacy rights. You may have to look at, declare how you guys would collect, modify, use, disclose procedures for identifying personal data. And all these considerations when we do, even before we do research, including procedures to protect against unauthorized use or unauthorized access. Now, in practical terms, if you are a team with funding, you may have to look at the practice of research assistants. Anybody in the research team, just having direct access to data. Personally, this is part of our problem. We had to move fast, and so access was rather relaxed. There was no data privacy law at that time, but today we'll have to think twice having that kind of setup. So you will have to look at robust data sharing procedures, especially when you have collaborators abroad. When you are dealing with specimen, you have to consider material transfer agreement, and all of these considerations have to be looked at even before you carry out research. Another aspect has to do with the design itself. Now, what is the research question? Obviously, you will see that in the cover letter, in the title page, abstract. And the primary consideration there is the question whether your research is, to begin with, classified as human subjects research. You have to look at whether your research is adherent to the principle of privacy by design or privacy by default. No? And there's a discussion of that, a separate discussion of that in the toolkit that I referenced earlier, or directly to this page. No? So have a look at this when you want to pursue this question on your own. Privacy by design, PBD research. Another important considerations is, of course, the research question itself. You question whether it determines whether it has appropriate sensitivity, observe certain level of sensitivity, whether it needs to be reviewed thoroughly. Some research questions are rather no more than minimal risk, and so it doesn't deserve multiple sessions in the ethics committee. It doesn't deserve thorough review as opposed to those with greater than minimal risk. The research question also determines the extent of privacy protection that has to be put in place. Now, the question of soundness has to do with the ethical soundness, has to do with the plan that is put in place, whether there's privacy protection, whether there's risk management. The approach, whether the scientific soundness has to do with generalizability of your research, appropriateness, and whether the methodology is sound as well. No? Looking at statistical, your inclusion, statistical aspects, inclusion-exclusion criteria, reliability, validity. Now, all these considerations are part and parcel of research ethics review and privacy review, no? Including data management. Why is this important? Because it demonstrates our accountability and the level of awareness we have with regard to privacy. Increasingly also, big research grants would require you to have a data management plan. I'm not sure how much research you carry out, but the more you access big funders, the more you'll see this kind of requirement. Inventory of digital assets, that's part of the digital management plan. It's a demonstration that you really know what you're doing. It's a demonstration that you exercise or you pursue data integrity and security, and quality assurance in research. So research management plan includes description, relates nature and scope of collection of privacy risk, metadata. One of the faculty members, one of our colleagues, said in a public forum she hated metadata. I think it's quite irrational for her to say that, but metadata is something you cannot avoid. It's there every time you create data. There's just always going to be metadata. But more interestingly, we have to take a look at the standards to use, because metadata would have to contend with obsolescence, no? And usability. Now, what is useful now may no longer be useful decades to come. There's also a question of preservation versus presentation files. Now, when we make presentations in the PowerPoint, the resolution, for instance, for pictures would be less than the pictures that we intend to keep for a very long time. So that is with the intent of preservation. Presentation, you want it to be portable, easy to display, and so the resolution may not amount to much. Backup and archiving, part of the consideration, because one of the often neglected aspect of research is what you do with data. Once research is done, the funding is gone, no? And so you might want to plead with your research office to have some kind of a data archiving system so that you don't have to collect primary information all the time, no? And you may benefit from the work of those who came before you. So archival is important. To do that, you have to take into account the workflow, versioning system, periodic restoration, and recovery testing. And I cannot overemphasize that aspect because I've seen people backing up their data and only to realize later on that those backups are not actually good because the restoration process has not been tested, has not been validated. So corrupted yung data, yung backup rather, so useless din yung backup. You will have to have policies on access devices. Some sensitive firms or agencies I know of would ban USB, for instance. That's one source of privacy breach. If you're storing your data in Google Cloud, in Google Drives, you may have to have a second look at that, especially permissions. If you're collaborating with other institutions, with people who don't have at UP accounts, and so you are giving them access to your stash, your online stash, you may consider having policies on that. Data format is not something to be sneezed at. It may be boring. This is probably why people hate metadata, but data formats are important. For those of you who have been long enough, may have come across with formats like BMP. I'm not sure if you still use that format, but they're pretty much around. Archival selection, because you cannot archive everything. Data retention period, how long are you going to archive them? If it's forever, you better state so. Maybe there's a need for you to de-identify certain columns, certain aspects of your data. Is it going to be public repository? And this is part of my advocacy that researchers would publish their data sets in public repositories. And whether it's qualitative or quantitative, there are already public repositories that hold data from different sources for further reuse. You can extend the usefulness of your data, of your research, by having your data set archived publicly for open data purposes, open science purposes. Who has custody of the project? If this is going to be private, if you keep it to yourself, are you really the rightful keeper, the holder of that data, especially if it's not declared in your informed consent or in your in your research policy? Sharing, whom to share? Are you going to share whole or partial? Part of the data management plan. You look at the consent process. Is the consent process or does the consent process guarantee you keeping the data for a very long time? What is the access procedure? Are you going to share it with government or with private? And this is a problem now in big data, in artificial intelligence, where you just have to keep on reusing data, merge them with other data sets and the like. Is there going to be a review and oversight on the data sharing agreement, part of the data management plan? So another important consideration when you process data has to do with breaches, unauthorized processing of information. This phenomenon has three aspects: availability, integrity, and confidentiality. Availability breach stems from the loss, accidental or unlawful destruction of personal data. Integrity breach from unauthorized alteration of personal data. At one point, BPI was affected by this. No, some people became instant millionaires. That is an example of integrity breach. That the data that you hold is not actually doesn't have integrity. It can be altered, whether accidentally or intentionally. Confidentiality breach, and for most part, this is what many researchers are concerned about. This stems from unauthorized disclosure or access to personal data. But all these three are constituting breach, not just confidentiality breach. So some of these examples, you might have lost your laptop, USB drives, paper records in the trash can, not shredded, hard drives being disposed of without, shredding the data inside there, inside the drive, without, sanitizing the data inside, databases being hacked, employees accessing or disclosing personal information outside the requirements. So some people might call you about certain data subjects that you have. That is an example of data breach. Paper records being stolen. It used to be the case that researchers would just sell their filled out survey questionnaires to the market. Pinapakilo yan. And that's no longer allowed, especially when the data sheets, filled out data sheets, are not anonymized, are not, would still include rather personal information. An organization mistakenly providing personal information to the wrong person. Maybe if someone would ask for your pay slip, and then the staff would just give the pay slip to that person kasi inutusan, when in fact there's no authority for that person. An individual deceiving an agency into properly releasing the information. This is a case, for instance, involving HR. Someone calling HR to ask for the employment status of that particular individual. This case about HIV patients actually happened. This is in the UK, where an AIDS treatment clinic would issue periodic newsletter to its patients, HIV patients. But then at one time, the clinic, the one who sent out such newsletter, nakasisi po lahat ng mga may AIDS patient. And so it's an accidental disclosure of identity of people who have AIDS. We also see that, in lesser danger, in lesser form, involving colleagues who are just so fond of CCing a lot of people, nakakilometric yan, and we have colleagues, especially the less tech savvy ones, would just CC everybody, and that is a potential violation of privacy. Our organization discovering that an employee inadvertently placed data containing names, addresses, phone numbers, to their website. I see this once in a while, people believing na sila lang yung nakakaalam sa address. So for convenience, they would upload an Excel file or a doc file containing personal information, thinking that they are the only ones who know where it is. They don't really understand the way search bots work. So these examples. Another principle of privacy is legitimate purpose. We ensure that the way we carry out information collection is according to legitimate purposes. there is a resource I have put together for you, privacyph.org/Q&A, where this subject can be pursued in greater detail. In particular, I'd like to direct your attention to the so-called legitimate purpose test, which has the following components. Purpose is articulated, the necessity of the collection is established, and there's a balancing of usefulness, of utility, and data subjects protection. So if you have all these considerations in mind, you pass the test, then you pass the principle of legitimate purpose. You are in accordance with legitimate purpose principle. The third principle has to do with consent. I have explained this to you earlier, but for those who are doing research, we have put together a consent that is privacy aware. So if you're about to carry out your master's thesis, your research, and this involves consent, consider looking at this template that we have put together for you. This is also included in the template. Now, one quick note on the standards of consent. Suppose you intend to revisit your data subjects. Increasingly, this standard, a European standard, is adopted in many territories, jurisdictions in the world, including the Philippines. And you may no longer be able to just revisit your participants, your data subjects, your research subjects, without asking permission from the ethics committee. So it is important to be observing consent or informed consent, because again, you'll see this increasingly being observed by journals when you publish. One of the questions is that journals would demand from you whether some evidence, demand from you some evidence that the consent you got was in fact done legitimately. You see this in studies that are very much frowned upon, sanctioned in fact. There's this fiasco at the Cornell University involving university professors who had to dodge Cornell's ethics committee, went straight to Facebook to conduct the so-called contagion study. And there's sizable literature on the question. I urge you to follow this through, because for lack of space, lack of time, we'll no longer be able to discuss it here. But the idea is that you have to clear your consent process or consent methodology via the ethics committee. And so this is how bad it is in the publications world. So a study, 45-year-old paper, lacked informed consent, retracted. So it seems that the journal people are really getting serious with consent for them to really retract a very old paper on the grounds of the lack of informed consent. You also see this when we take pictures. Suppose someone discovers that the picture you are publishing involves people who haven't given consent to you, then that is a ground for retraction. So imagine if you are a sloppy researcher, unable to get a consent for a particular picture that you feel important important enough to be included in the final paper. And then later on, a complaint will be lodged and say, hey, you haven't gotten my permission. Or if you have, where's the evidence, and you cannot show anything, that is a ground for retraction. So I understand that consent is a sensitive issue for some. There are alternatives, especially for research, not just data subjects processing or personal information processing. And such alternatives may include verbal consent, and maybe even the National Ethics Committee allows waive consent. No? So the question with respect to waive consent is, what is actually being waived? Is it the process or the form? And I tend to be on the side of the view that it's just the form that is being waived. The process is so much more essential. Is an essential element of research that you cannot really waive the process. There has to be some kind of consent, no? Not necessarily involving forms. Hence, informed consent without forms. No? Looking at the effect of forms themselves. No? Sabi nila, mga Pilipino daw, ayaw pumirma. Baka isa na ako doon. Ang tamad-tamad kong pumirma. So, the legalese may be intrusive. It may threaten the integrity of research. You may also have to consider alternatives to signing forms, and that is via visual informed consent. Another principle has to do with limited use, disclosure, and retention. So it used to be that research would take so long, and rather the keeping of records rather would be forever, would be at least very, very long. Right now, the standard has to do on the side of limited use. No? So we have to take into account when you do research. No? We only keep records as long as necessary. There is a possible exception if you want to keep records longer than what you foresee, no? And that is by de-identifying that record. No? There are tools that you may need to be proficient in using to be able to de-identify the personal information in such record. But the problem really with the identification or stripping of or retaining digital copies is that there's just no way of telling how many copies are really out there. So if you are involved in this situation, where you take a loan from a loan shark and your collateral is a nude picture, even after you pay the loan shark, you really have no way of telling whether your nude picture is still with him or her. And in some situations, even the best among us would violate privacy. Even if you'd say naka-opt out, people have opted out already. It turned out that the records are still there. And that's already the National Health Service of UK. They have resources to supposedly expunge the records. But as you can see, that's 700,000 records kept even for people who are supposedly opted out already. So it's a bad thing. No? So disclosure, two ways of doing that, anonymously or pseudonymously. When you say anonymous, no chance of being linked back to individuals. Pseudonymously, you may have just to cloak the information so that it can still be linked given proper authority, given a fair process. So these aspects. However, in real world, the identification may not really be that sufficient, especially in the hands of less capable hands, people who are not into technical de-identification. They pose risk to people who have to their research subjects rather. No? So hence the threat persists even for the so-called anonymized or de-identified information. Security is not a product, it's a process that you have to observe. You're looking at proportionality and appropriateness when it comes to holding or processing, dealing with personal data. The more sensitive the data set is, the more secure it has to be. Okay, so there is an overlap between so-called information security and data privacy. They are not the same. They intersect on the questions of availability and the question of confidentiality and integrity. All the others are addressed via a process called privacy impact assessment, the principles we have discussed earlier on. But you pay attention to where privacy and security intersects. And let me emphasize, making the data available, making it confidential, and making it maintaining its integrity. Right? So there are tips how we keep our research data secure. We have study codes on the documents, encryption of identifiable data, as practical as removal of face sheet, separating it, keeping it, setting it aside, giving it to a custodian, properly disposal of data, limitation or limiting access to identifiable information, and then you can compartmentalize for this for people who have limited access. No, keeping data separate. For those who are doing anthropology, online anthropology, you may consider keeping your case notes, sensitive information separate from your database, from the ones you're sharing with colleagues, looking at access rights, and encryption, of course, of sensitive information. I'm afraid I have overshoot. That's 2 days of training compressed to an hour or so. Thank you very much. I hope this will really be a conversation. I've been just doing a monologue for an hour or so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really one of the crucial topics to talk about, Dr. C, especially since the digital age has changed the face of research, and we felt that after when the pandemic hit. Okay. So for sure, our audience were able to learn a lot from your discussion, because I did. And I will be giving you a few seconds to rest while we collate the questions given by our audiences from different streaming venues. So we have our Facebook page. We also have YouTube. And of course, we are live in our UPOU Networks page. Feel free to send your questions or comments through the chat boxes in those websites. Now, again, if we cannot accommodate your questions, we will be sending the answers through your email. So please don't forget to write your addresses as well. Okay, ready ka na ba, sir? Are you ready? Yeah, we have quite a number of questions here, and we would like to start with this one. Okay, Are there national standards on ethics and privacy in research, and how may all schools or research institutions teach or enforce this?
We have the National Ethical Guidelines. That's with the Department of Science and Technology. The Philippine Health Research, the FREB Ethics Board has that. You can later on. It's also linked, by the way, in the resource I have given you, notes.ethicist.org. So we have such a standard, and that standard echoes pretty much the standard of the international research community. How is that enforced? Right now, this is via sanctions. This is also enforced via accreditation, so that I believe the ethics committee, the OU ethics committee is level 1 accredited. All right, so that's one mechanism to enforce. It's taught in schools. Universities have research ethics committees. So there is a pressure, so to speak, to toe the line. So there's a National Ethics Committee. By the way, they're about to release the 2022 version. So watch out for that. There's a significant inclusion of privacy provisions there. So this is different from the last one a few years ago. So it's coming out, I think, pretty soon, in a matter of months. No, yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, doctor. So thank you very much. So for our next question, as course instructors, we are given the email addresses of our students. Is it ethical to send invitations to our students to participate in online survey studies related to their discipline? Their participation to the survey is purely voluntary and is not part of the course requirements. Yes, but by answering the survey, they may also learn how online surveys are done. So I think you've mentioned about vulnerability earlier. So yes, sir.
Asking students to participate is not bawal, and in fact, it's encouraged because we want to them to we're training them for research to begin with. What is frowned upon is the teacher doing research herself, and she would induce his students to participate in his research, and knowing that the students know who are not participating, so that there is a direct pressure in them to participate. I would, from what I've gathered with the question, this kind of research is more general, more like a studentry type of research, involving the whole student body. So it's not targeted. That particular class is not targeted by the teacher himself or herself who exercises authority over that particular class. That is my understanding. Yes.
Thank you, sir. So does that mean that we can invite them as long as they are not directly our students? Is that what you're?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what would be the workaround if we would like to invite our own students?
Have some advocates invite them that you would not know as a teacher, as a principal investigator. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't know who has participated, who has not participated.
Oh, okay. So we need, let's say, a research assistant. It's not enough that we just anonymize the data.
There are still contextual considerations because sometimes you are recruiting graduate students. Now, for instance, I have a graduate class with 3 students. So
yes,
it's easy to figure out who did what.
Yes, yeah, I can relate because we can even identify their handwriting sometimes.
Yes,
okay, yes, I get it now. Thank you, Dr. C. Okay, so let's proceed to our next question. Medyo madami po ang ating question kasi very interesting po ang ating topic today. So, okay. So how about this one, sir? Privacy issues when it comes to the processing of student data which are available to the registrar's office. How do we deal with these issues?
We will have to look at the protocol. So I would always make the qualifier that we have to take a look at the study protocol. Right now, we're simply speculating. The final determination of whether the study is appropriate or not, it comes with the research protocol, right? But on the elements provided, again, I'll make a qualifier that we're simply speculating here. Absent the protocol, we cannot make a final determination as to the soundness of the study itself. So registrar data, there could be some use cases where we really have to access registrar data or data from the registration. The other workaround, possible workaround, is to declare as a question, as a matter of transparency, that all OU students can potentially be contacted for research.
Oh, okay.
Right from the get-go.
Yes.
They know that that data, and they can opt out. So for instance, when they enroll, you can declare that OU is a research university, and we encourage our people to research. It's possible that you will be contacted for research that may be related to OU and your interest. Will you be amenable to such possibility, to the possibility of being contacted?
Okay.
That's one. The other, if it were a quality assurance type of research, suppose that the registrar itself would like to see certain certain relationships between cohorts of individuals and certain outcomes, they can well do that because it's in the purview of their mandate.
Okay.
Right. But if you're just an ordinary faculty, you cannot just walk into the registrar's office. Say, can I have the addresses and phone numbers of these people? And this is becoming a flashpoint, so to speak, especially with your students who are already 18 and above. So you can no longer invoke parental authority. So the parents cannot just march to the registrar and say, "I demand the grades of my child," because he's no longer a child, no. But in the eyes of the mommy, it's gonna be child forever, no.
Yes.
It doesn't work like that. No?
That's so unfair. Dapat meron din ganyan nung bata ako. Sayang. But anyway, so yes, I understand now, and this is also applicable to those researchers who, let's say, are already having the access of contact details. For example, sila po yung may hawak ng directory ng isang company. So they cannot just simply, ask them, use their details to invite them. Tama po ba?
Yes po. Data collection is always with a purpose. So if your purpose is to do research A, you cannot use the data set from research A to do research B.
Right. So that's very, very clear. Now let's proceed to our next question. So this one. Are there research ethics or data privacy principles to be considered or violated, if any, if the survey questionnaire is administered through Google Forms and sent through emails or messengers?
Not specifically with Google Forms, but there are security issues, especially sharing the data on the back end. There are alternatives that are probably more appropriate to doing specific research, especially sensitive ones. Kobo Toolbox, for instance, is another alternative that you can. RedCap is another. More privacy-focused platforms.
Yeah.
So, so these considerations, no. So the violation would likely be on the security side if you're not careful. I'm not saying that we cannot use Google Forms at all. It depends on use cases. If it were just ordinary research, like whether. I'm not sure types of research who are going to vote, maybe not that sensitive anymore. But if it's for research like mental health, like suicidal ideation, criminal activities, drug use, I would caution you against using Google Forms.
Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, there's this one thing that I cannot really move on, sir, because we have lots of questions about this already. Earlier, you mentioned about informed consent. So I think, should all surveys accompany the long version? You've mentioned about waiving consent. So, because I can totally relate to this because I had this experience wherein the participants were actually making fun of the 2-page informed consent attached in a simple survey. So, do we actually have a shortcut, or how can we make what are the scope of having a waived consent?
For one, the research has to be has to involve minimal risk.
Okay.
So the lower the risk, the greater is the chance of it being waived. All right. The waiving of consent, or even the review itself, is not is not something that can be delegated to the researcher. So the researcher has to secure permission from the research ethics committee that is going to do exempt. As to the informed consent itself, no, apply for exemption rather. As to the informed consent, certain elements, these are essential elements in research. You can include them, but increasingly, it's no longer about ticking boxes. Because I see researchers, para mas mapadali, nakatik lang yung boxes. It has to be in a form that's really understandable to research subjects, no? And the concurrence. So in other words, it can be made short, plain and concise, because that's really the idea to begin with, no? There is a superstition, a wrong view out there that the longer your consent, the better. As a matter of fact, at some point, there's going to be a trade-off between length and understanding. The longer your informed consent form is, the less likely it's going to be understood.
And read.
So you would want to keep it short and sweet, but completeness is still there. No, it doesn't mean that if it's short, it's not complete. So the elements are there, but you can keep it short and in a language that's really understandable to the participants.
Yes, I think that's very important because it's just that today, I mean, if you can observe all the conferences, presentations are getting shorter and shorter. Like dati, parang we can present 30 minutes, but now parang 5 minutes or 10 minutes is already enough. So I think it's also reasonable to shortcut the informed consent in a very concise way.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can make the argument that if your paper cannot be presented in a Twitter thread form,
160 characters. Tama po ba? 160 characters
or something in a thread, maybe 5 posts.
Oh, okay. So kailangan pala talagang ganun na. Sige, we will try to do that. Yes, especially in a TikTok world na talagang very short ang attention span. Okay. So speaking of informed consent as well, what if the posts are already public? Do we still need to get informed consent, sir?
It depends on the subject and the question. But I'd like to disabuse people in thinking that what is public is no longer personal. So these are not mutually exclusive categories. Some people post publicly about their personal lives and they don't actually know how to deal with the platform, and so it's public from your eyes, but people have the right to act stupidly. So you cannot say that, oh, you posted it public and so it ceases to be private. or it ceases to be a personal information. No, so public post would still involve personal information. The law is protecting personal information. The law doesn't say that personal information ceases to be personal when it's posted publicly.
Fine.
You see the difference?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's still protected. Whether you still need consent, it depends again on the protocol. Remember earlier that we need to see the study protocol, the study proposal to really make a firmer determination whether the approach is sound or not.
Yes, sir.
All right. So when you collect, for instance, Twitter, when you collect a publicly posted Twitter post,
Yes.
are they? Is that something that falls outside privacy protection? I would say that not necessarily. But if you aggregate it to the level that it's no longer recognizable and you're able to handle secondary attributes properly, it's possible that it is going to be classified as a data set coming from a public repository, purely public repository, no longer involving personal information, which is, by the way, again, going to depend on the subject matter. Suicidal ideation, criminal activities, even if they're posted publicly. You see, for instance, there is this Russian soldier who raped a 1-year-old toddler and took a video of and posted it in Telegram, and people were able to record that crime. You cannot invoke privacy there, nor can invoke the other way around. It's public and not private. You see the difference?
There are really lots of concepts to be taken into consideration. So ethics is really, not just black and white talaga. Okay. All right. So, sir, let me just go through that since you already mentioned repositories. Okay. So speaking of archiving, since student outputs will be archived, okay, and eventually it will be available for public access. This mean that all student activities that we are planning to publish in the repository should undergo ethical review?
The mandate of the ethics of the ethics committee, if you're talking about ethical review by the ethics committee, is to review research proposals, right? Maybe in special considerations where you would want them to review as well repositories or platforms, no, the mechanics, the policies, so that can still be done, no? Now, there may be a need for us to train our students to do technical de-identification, especially if the research involves certain data types, because certain data types would have secondary attributes that even if you take away the names, the primary identifiers, you can put 2 and 2 together with the secondary attributes and still be able to identify the individuals. So if the data set is something like that, then you may have to train the students to use certain tools so that they can release the data set publicly.
Sir, does that mean that even if we are just giving activities, let's say to high school students or even grade schoolers who would like to, we would like them to be trained for research, dadaan na po yun sa ethical committee?
It depends on your policy. That's why you have the standard operating procedures.
Okay.
In some universities, they are just relegated to the departments. They do not necessarily go up to the level of the ethics committee.
All right.
Academic setup is like that, no, for class purposes, for class exercises like Psych 101, where people are doing research on perception,
Yes, sir.
on taste, hindi naman nakakalason. These are just readily available food. And then they will have activities in class. That's not necessarily something that goes all the way up to the ethics committee.
All right. Okay. So your answer is golden, sir. Okay. So meron pa tayong, we still have a few more questions.
There are questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw them.
Yes, sir. Actually, some of them are already answered. Yes, the one is about the registrar's office and the other one, okay, this one. So, what ethical issues should I consider when conducting research with adults who may lack decision-making capacity due to cognitive impairment? This is from Jerwin Lique. I hope I pronounced it correctly, from the Philippine Christian University, Manila.
Cognitive impairment, by definition, takes away their capacity to decide for themselves. No, it depends on the nature of the conditions themselves, because it may not be consistent throughout. There could be lucid moments where these people are able to make decisions for themselves. But having said that, as a safeguard, you may consider looking at proxy consent coming from their legally authorized representative, or what we call in local literature as LAR, legally authorized representative. So if these are adults, their caregivers, their family, who have the legal authority to do so. Yeah, that should be it, unless you have other things in mind, no. But as I said, it depends on the condition, because cognitive impairment may be episodic,
Yes,
not necessarily throughout. So you might want, and if these are abandoned people, and maybe another group, you will look at a social work department as their legally authorized representative. So that's the alternative. No. So, but then again, as I said, depending on the conditions you're dealing with, the actual conditions.
So this is actually on the principle of autonomy.
Yes.
Okay, so another question, sir, are there privacy? Okay, we've mentioned Twitter a while ago. Someone is asking if there are privacy issues when you plan to do content analysis on Facebook Facebook private groups.
First, let's clarify what counts as private groups, because it's one thing to have a family chat, a family group that's private, quote unquote, and it's another to have a politician X private chat with membership running up to 50,000.
Yes.
It's not public, it's classified as private, but there are just too many of them. So do you draw a number line and say 100 above public na yan, no? But having raised that preliminary qualification, if you're a member of that group, or if you signed up for the purpose of research, it's going to be a toss up on the kind of research you're going to do. If it's going to be more ethnographic, very intrusive, it may affect the behavior of members in that online group. No? Pag alam nila na taga-OU ka at nagre-research ka, maybe they're no longer going to behave naturally before you, or at least they will be more guarded in their chat. So that's one consideration. If the research is simply attitude, and you look at contents and it's basically retrospective, so before you got in, and say you look at posts when Facebook started, say 20 whatever up to 2010, if it's going to be like that. Maybe it's not going to affect the outcome, no, as much as say active, like attitude towards integrity of public servants, something like that. No? Paying taxes, that kind of thing. No, that may have a different direction altogether. So again, I will go back to my motherhood qualifier. Let's take a look at your project proposal with your research proposal. Let's take a look at your protocol. Let's look at your methodology, right? That's how. Let's look at the ethical considerations if you have covered sufficiently the different aspects. So that's the ultimate qualifier. But as I said, it's going to depend on the very question you're going to raise to pursue.
Yes. All right. So our next question here is about pictures. So what are your thoughts regarding using photos as a form of attendance documentation in some offices, public or private? Do you have separate paper on this? Thanks and God bless. This is from Antonio Sierra.
Like the Zoom call, COA is supposed to be interested in seeing the screen cap of people attending the pictures for audit purposes, and that's allowed to the extent that it's for the fulfillment of administrative duties. No, but it's another when you use the pictures to probe into the domestic situation of people. So if that is the kind of research meant intrusive, meant to pursue questions other than what is the declared purpose,
yes,
then it becomes dicey. Remember the principle of transparency,
yes,
which I said could be overridden by other considerations like security. These principles are not standalone and they are not absolute, but they are always taken as a balancing act. So you look at transparency, security, consent. So if you want to override consent, you better have a very good purpose. Now, if the purpose is rather shady, then the more you have to uphold consent and security and other considerations.
All right. So, okay. So on behalf of those teachers who suddenly have to go from face-to-face to online, so this may not be directly related to research, but those teachers who are creating modules are actually using pictures as well, sir. So how can we actually safeguard ourselves when it comes to violation of privacy? Because sometimes we use pictures from the internet. We just copy paste them for personal sharing or sometimes for lecture purposes. So how will we know what's allowed or not?
There's fair use. There's principle of fair use to the extent that you declare your sources and there is no malice. That is allowed to the extent, and the publication is limited to your studentry, to your audience. That does not take into account IPR issues, because sometimes we just neglect that it says copyrighted, and it's for your eyes only. If you want to use this picture, ask permission from me. That's a separate question altogether. But speaking generally, instruction is or education is amenable to fair use, to Creative Commons license, especially when there's it's explicitly stated that it's CC license, not non-commercial and so on.
Thank you, sir. Another, I'm conducting a qualitative study and the co-participants were chosen based on the locations of the lead co-participants. Did I violate guidelines for social sciences research? Just the question.
I'm not sure if I understand the question fully. My impression is that you have geolocation. Geolocation is a protected piece of information. So if it's about profiling and in a way that's gonna compromise the privacy of individuals, to the extent that it's part of the proposal, it can be done. What is the sensitivity level has to be taken into account. Now, if it were a geolocation of people with certain conditions, stigmatizing conditions, no, and that is another matter altogether. No? If it's simply to make a case, I'm being whimsical here. If it's simply going to make a case, for instance, a concentration of highest IQ, no, of people with higher IQ, no, is it Malabon versus Manila, and you can see the geolocation of people, and there's apparently more concentration in Malabon. That's probably not as bad as, say, people who have had drug use, who have been subjected to Operation Tokhang, no? Malabon versus Manila, no, that kind of data. Again, we're going to go back to the question. What is your research question?
Protocol,
And
yeah.
Protocol, yeah.
Okay. So another, sir, for clarification, so this is naman again about intellectual property. So is it considered a work of plagiarism if some of the context of the original articles were rephrased, but the source is cited?
There is a certain extent that you can do that, no? But if it's rephrasing the entire book, that would still be plagiarism and presenting it as your own, even if you cite. And even with citation, there's only a certain percentage that you can, certain number of lines that you can use to be considered fair use, no? But for teachers especially, I think many of you are aware that there are online tools for rephrasing sources. So whether acknowledged or not, that's something that we have to contend with. No, you can acknowledge, but then it may well be the case that it's the entire article that's being rephrased, and then you put in intervening citations, no, precisely to deceive. So there's probably an intention to deceive you as a teacher, no, to begin with.
Thank you. And speaking of deception, sir, what are some of the ethical issues raised by deception in research, and when is it ethically acceptable to use deception?
You pinapawisan ako sa mga tanong niyo kasi these questions are normally, I have a separate presentation on deception, but to make a rather long lecture short in form of conversation here today, there's a distinction between so-called active and passive deception. Preliminary notes. One is that the American Psychological Association has declared it, has made it a mission to seriously cut back on deception. This is the American Psychological Association because they figured that it's going to cause more harm to the discipline, to the reputation of the discipline. Ay, may mga psychology student dyan. And interestingly, I know you have psych offerings. ang mga estudyante, parang natutuwa sila pag ang kanilang experiment involves deception. Nakakaisa sila. So ito yung impression ng mga colleagues namin, no? Deception kaagad kasi parang na-excite sila, no? But then again, as I said, the American Psychological Association figured that we should really be cutting back on studies involving deception. Only those studies that are absolutely necessary, no, can invoke or can, to a limited extent, use deception. Deception, as I said, active or passive. Active, where you say, where you actively lie. Passive is you disclose, you don't disclose certain vital information. There are measures to mitigate deception, at least the ill effect. One is to declare in your informed consent that somewhere in this transaction, you're going to be deceived. And you're going to be debriefed later on. Or at least in your methodology, say, I will not say anything about deception, but I will actively debrief them. And if they experience certain untoward psychological events, I have a psychological first aid on standby to deal with them. No? Some studies have resulted, good studies have resulted out of deception, Milgram experiment, Zimbardo, these classic experiments. But then increasingly, people are suspicious of these types of studies and are looking more to alternatives. No, we haven't explored alternatives that may yield similar, if not equally valid outcomes. No, for instance, role playing. No, konti pa lang talaga naggumagawa ng role playing as a modality of study. Retrospective study, more naturalistic type of study. You can tweak the environment such that you expect them to. You can observe how people would actually react, as opposed to in an interview where there is some kind of a game theoretic dynamic going on. The interviewee is kind of reading you, wants to read what you want to expect him to say. You understand? Iniisip niya, ano ka nang iniisip ni ma'am? Nasasabihin ko. Yun yung sasabihin ko. And Margaret Mead and many other important social scientists have been at the receiving end of that kind of behavior in people. So deception, there are measures to mitigate deception. And if you are planning to do deception, think hard whether that's really the only way to go. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's it, sir. That's it for our question and answer. Thank you. I think we've covered all the questions we have in the chat boxes. And thank you for sending your questions. Thank you, Dr. C, for answering them. I think, it's really, really advantageous to talk with an expert compared to studying the topics on your own. Like in a few hours' time, we are able to learn so much. Imagine how many hours would that need kapag ikaw ang magbabasa, di ba? Okay, so yes, again, we definitely learned a lot from the topics you have shared with us this morning. And as a token of our gratitude, we would like to award a certificate to you. Okay, with a citation, UP Open University Office of the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs presents this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Peter C. for delivering a talk on ethics in social sciences as part of research conversations held on 12 April 2022, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. live streamed at UPOU Networks. Signed, Dr. Primo G. Garcia, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. Now, to officially close this webinar and give us a synthesis on the topics discussed, we would like to call on Dr. Myra D. Oruga, Assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Research and Publication.
Thank you, Ma'am Ria. On behalf of our Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Dr. Primo G. Garcia, our Chancellor, Dr. Melinda Bandalaria, Vice Chancellor for Finance, Dr. Jean Saludades, Deans of the 3 UP faculty of UPOU, Dr. Joanne Serrano, the Dean of the Faculty of Management and Development Studies, Dr. Ricardo Bagarinaw, the Dean of the Faculty of Education, and Dr. Diego Maranan, the Dean of the Faculty of Information and Communication Studies, administrators of UPOU. I am Dr. Myra Uruga, the Assistant to the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Research and Publication. Would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar, especially to Dr. Peter C., our speaker, for sparing his time to talk about this important topic as we course through increasing the awareness of our UPOU constituents as well as our stakeholders on research ethics, especially its association on data privacy. In his talk, he walked us through by defining first research ethics, conducts of research to the use of any outcome from research. Review the principles of ethics that includes beneficence, benefits and risk, justice and fairness. Important consideration in choosing participants, considering their vulnerability. He further discussed the ethics of online research, that it is not special, it's derivable from ethics for offline setting. Tinder as a methodological tool, hashtag emerging digital practices. On the data privacy, it includes and encompasses human subjects and data subjects and its protection. Risk to subjects, minimize risks involved was discussed, such as physical, economic, social, psychological, dignitary in data subjects with the inclusion of privacy. Erasure, right to be forgotten. Private information, specific purposes by an individual. Sensitive personal information under Section 31 RA 10173, individual race, ethnics, marital status, age, color, health records, license, etc. Personal info controller. These are the most important of all, especially when to the reviewers, we have to be warrant on this sensitive information, as well as to the researcher themselves. Okay? Transparency is very important. This is actually under Section 11. Be informed of whether personal info is being processed. Public should be informed, and governance also. Policies, procedure for handling the data. The term of privacy design and privacy default. Determine sensitivity level, extent of review, extent of privacy protection, and research questions. Dr. C also emphasizes data management. This is what we always tell our researchers, that they should include this in their proposal, what their plans are, especially, and how they should carry out and address this. Sometimes, Dr. C, they just copy-paste it. Typically, copying it from one research to another. We always say, you have to articulate it to yourself. It is not, your research is not the same as the research of other people. So it has to be original. The data management should be according to how you will implement your research. Okay? Processing of data, he also discussed on breach, availability, integrity, and especially confidentiality. The legitimacy of purpose, the very important consent, watchful of the retraction, consent for further consideration, such as verbal and waive consent. The limited use and disclosure retention. Security, privacy, protection. He mentioned also some tips on how to do security. At this digital age, as Ma'am Ria have said, when data should be kept private, gets into the wrong hands, bad things can happen. That's why data privacy is very important. With that, I'd like to close this webinar, and I'd like again to thank everyone. And I hope to see you all next time to another webinar series. This time, it's all about ethics among vulnerable groups. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Myra Oruga. Okay, so as promised, we will be issuing webinar certificates for this event in exchange for your evaluation forms. The link is being flashed on your screen. Please be very careful in typing your name, double-checking all information before clicking the submit button. The e-certificates will be emailed within 48 hours after you have accomplished the evaluation form. Thank you once again, everyone. This is Ria, and I hope to see you again in our next research conversation happening this 29 April 2022. Goodbye and good morning.